Hi, today we're going to be talking about integrating source materials. And here's an overview of the workshop. We're going to talk about types of sources, primary sources, and secondary sources. We're going to talk about how to integrate your sources into your work. We're going to talk about citing your sources. And then we're going to go through an example demonstrating how you can use what you've learned in the workshop practically within your own writing. So to get started, we're going to talk about the different types of sources. The first type is a primary source. This is usually an original document, and it's created at the time of the event that you're studying. Examples of this include historical documents, artifacts, novels, diaries, anything that engages with an event at the time in which it was happening. A secondary source, on the other hand, is a source produced after an event. It's commonly used to provide interpretation or background for a primary source. So a textbook could be an example of a secondary source because usually a textbook is not written during the time in which the events are occurring. It happens years and years later and looks back upon that event. A literary criticism is a great example. Sometimes people will write criticisms of novels. For example, someone could study the different themes present in a literary text such as Moby Dick. And this would be a secondary source because it's commenting on the primary source. Volumes and biographies also could be included in potential secondary works. Often teachers will require students to have a couple primary works and then also some secondary works. So it's important to know the difference so that you can fulfill those requirements in your own writing. Now, how do you integrate these sources into your paper? The first thing that I would recommend is for you to introduce your quotes. Don't begin your sentence with a quote. Always introduce it in some way. This is a common mistake that I see among first-year writing students. They don't know how to effectively integrate their quote into their paper, so they'll just drop it in there. Your sentence will begin with a quote, end with the quote, and then they'll go on, which brings me to my next point. Thoroughly explain and analyze any quotes that you use. So after you have introduced your quote and given your quote, make sure that you analyze it. Don't leave it up to your reader to figure out what you're saying themselves. I always say that you want to baby your reader along. Assume that your reader might not make the exact same connections that you're using. So explain the quote, but also analyze it. Don't just restate what the quote says. Tell your reader why you're using the quote, how it relates to the rest of your paper, how it furthers your argument, or how it furthers the historical background of your paper. Give a reason why, and lead your reader down that path. And so once you've done this, you'll have what we call a quote sandwich. So your quote will be sandwiched between your introduction of the quote and your analysis of the quote. A general rule for how to do this is try to make it twice as much analysis as you have quoted material. So if you quote if you put in an excerpt that is roughly a line long, try to bring out a couple lines of analysis of your own work. You want your paragraphs to be predominantly your own. The crux of your argument propped up by your own words with your quotes helping to prop that up, but not being the entirety of your point in your analysis. Now, citing sources, we're just going to get briefly into how to do this. First, know what citation method you're using. Often these will change depending on what class you're in. So some teachers use MLA, some use APA, some use Chicago, and oftentimes they'll modify these different citation methods with a few of their own rules. So pay attention to what requirements your teacher may have. Cite all quoted material, but also cite all paraphrased material. Most students know to cite quoted material, but often they don't cite paraphrased material. If you got your information from another source, even if you don't quote that source exactly, you still need to provide that citation. So make sure that you do that. Include an abbreviated in-text citation after your source's material. And this will, again, change based on whichever citation method you use. But make sure that you are following the guidelines according to whichever one you need to do. And include a full citation at the end of the paper. All right, here's an example of a paragraph that uses quoted material, but there are several things that can be improved. So I'm just going to go ahead and read through it, and if you'd like, you can pause the video and try to figure out how you would change this paragraph to integrate the quotes more in a more clean manner into the text. So I'm going to go ahead and read through, and we'll see what we can do with this. Research shows that excellent writing skills help college students find and keep jobs when they enter into the workforce after graduation. Quote, people who demonstrate above average writing skills make an average of $4,000 more annually than people who do not hone these skills during their college years. Close quote. Unfortunately, this process is often overlooked by college students. Quote, many college students enter into writing classes looking to pass the class and move on rather than to find ways to improve their writing skills. This is an unfortunate trend that needs to be addressed. Now I've included this example, which is the same paragraph, but it's with a few things added in. I've added in red anytime I introduce the quote. In blue, I've added in the in-text citations. In green is analysis of the quote. So we'll just go ahead and read through and comment on each as they come up. The first sentence is exactly the same. It says, research shows that excellent writing skills help college students find and keep jobs when they enter into the workforce after graduation. Jane Doe, an economics researcher at the University of North Florida, comments on this trend, writing, quote, people who demonstrate above average writing skills make an average of $4,000 more annually than people who do not hone these skills during their college years. Now I'm going to stop briefly just to comment on the introduction. There are several ways to introduce a quote. And here I've used two different styles. If you look down, the John Doe comments on this trend in his book, What is Wrong with the World Today, is another way to introduce a quote. But there are many, many dozens, if not hundreds of ways to introduce a quote naturally into your sentence. So don't just pull these examples out and use them exclusively, but see if you can figure out your own ingenuitive ways to introduce quotes. I've used just for this example MLA in-text citation, but again that might change based on what your professor requires. And this green part that we're about to jump into is the quote analysis. It says, writing competency enables students to demonstrate that they can be valuable assets to a business, allowing them to more successfully transition into the workforce than people who do not possess the same writing skills. Unfortunately, college students often overlook this process. Here's the second introduction. John Doe comments on this trend in his book, What is Wrong with the World Today? Quote, many college students enter into writing classes looking to pass a class and move on rather than to find ways to improve their writing skills. Without an understanding of the importance of these writing classes, students can view writing class as a nuisance. They take the class because they need it to graduate, but put in the minimal effort necessary to pass. This is an unfortunate trend that needs to be addressed. So, briefly, in closing, you can see visually with the colors the quote sandwich that we talked about earlier. It begins with an introduction, which is in red. Your quote appears in the gray here, and then afterwards there's analysis of the quote. So the quote is not exclusively what props up the argument. The argument is done mostly in your own words, but the quote is there to help make that point stronger, but not to make the point for you. And this is one of the main things that you need to understand when using quotes or using cited material. Make sure that you make the argument in your own words and that your own words are propping up the argument, not the quotes. So just to close out, here's what we talked about. We talked about types of sources, primary and secondary. We talked about how to introduce and analyze cited material. And then we also talked about how to cite sources. And then we closed with an example that we went through together. Thank you. I hope this workshop was helpful.